Hello, and welcome to our series called Unfinished Work. Unfinished Work is a four-part series on Harrisburg and the Civil War. Now, most of you know that we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of that great conflagration. It's called by many names: the War of the Rebellion, the War between the States, the War to free the slaves, Mr. Lincoln's War, the War of Blue and Gray, the War of Northern Aggression, the recent unpleasantness. But we don't know very much about how Harrisburg survived that war in the years of the 5 Aprils between 1861 and 1865. I've had the pleasure of sitting opposite Robert Phillips and discussing what did Harrisburg have to do with the Civil War. Why is it important for us to look at Harrisburg's role? What's Gettysburg got to do with it? Where was Robert E. Lee going anyway? How did it impact the lives of the people who lived here, the 13,000 folks, 2,500 or so of them who were African Americans? Tonight our guests are Caleb Jackson, George Nagel, and Todd Mealy, all great scholars, humanists, and writers who will share with you their intellect, their artifacts, and their writings. And so let us welcome first Mr. Caleb Jackson. Now, I call Caleb Jackson our history Sherlock Holmes because we often ask him to hunt down some facts. Bob, you asked me a really great question the other day. I thought you might want to pitch it to Caleb.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Linwood, for having me here this evening. Caleb, how did the African Americans in Harrisburg first get involved in the Civil War? What started to bring the population into the great conflict that was emerging?
Well, in my estimation, September 22nd, 1862, when Lincoln issued his preliminary proclamation, which basically said, I'm going to give the South 100 days to stop the war and come back into the Union. If they don't, I'm going to free the slaves that they have, and I'm going to enlist African Americans into the Civil War. And of course, this was very exciting in Harrisburg, and it really built up so that December 31st, the day before the Emancipation Proclamation, we had what was the first, what we call watch night, when people assembled in the churches and watched and waited to see if the South would stop the war. Of course, they didn't, and the next day Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South that were in the states that were in rebellion, and also authorized the North to start recruiting blacks for the Army.
Now, before you talk about the authorization, go back just a minute and explain to our viewers this subtlety in the law about freeing the enslaved in the Confederate states. But we know that there were states that stayed in the Union.
That's correct. It's just the states that were in rebellion. There were so-called border states that had slaves, which did not succeed and basically stayed in the Union. And this order did not free those slaves.
So what happened in Delaware or Maryland or?
Those slaves remained slaves.
So during the war,
during the rest of the war,
these
yes,
states?
They were slaves the remainder of the war because they were in the so-called border states.
Tell Bob how Harrisburg felt on January 1st when they woke up. And
they were enthusiastic because they realized that now was the time for the men to go into the service. They realized that the war was going to continue and they're going to have to get involved in it.
We know that there was a famous meeting on January 15th of 1863 at Bethel AME Church, which was on Short Street there.
Yes.
Where was Short Street?
Short Street was the street which was now torn down. It was in the old 8th Ward. If you know where the old City Hall is on Walnut Street, the old City Hall apartments, right in front of that was a street that ran one block, and that was called Short Street.
So it's kind of where the Forum is now.
Yes, it probably ran from the old City Hall apartments into where the Forum building is now.
This is a really great story about January 15th, Bob. Would you share it, Caleb?
Yes, January the 15th, the African Americans of Harrisburg met at Bethel Church, and they endorsed the Emancipation Proclamation. They voted. They had a conference. They basically said that they endorsed the Emancipation Proclamation, and they also told the slaves that were in the states that were not freed to be of good cheer because your day will be coming.
Mm-hmm.
So back to Bob's question, how did they eventually get into uniforms, and what was the process of recruitment?
In Massachusetts, John Andrews, the governor, immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation, he announced, he asked for permission and was given permission to form the 54th Massachusetts, which was the first regiment in the North. They sent out recruiters to almost every northern state, and in Harrisburg, Thomas Morris Chester was a paid recruiter, and he recruited in Harrisburg, Middletown, and throughout the Cumberland Valley for troops to go to the 54th.
And we know of a very famous meeting that happened in the 8th Ward. I believe it was in the Masonic Hall.
Masonic Hall, I think that was in early June of 1863. And they brought together the troops that were to go to Reading, Massachusetts to be trained in the 54th, but they had a big send-off at the Masonic Home. And there were speeches by David Stevens, I think Samuel Bennett, Thomas Morris Chester, and others.
And then Mr. Chester went with them?
He went with them. He accompanied the recruits to Reading, Massachusetts.
How many recruits?
I think there were, I understand, at least about 200.
200
in excess of
young
200
men.
of young men that left Harrisburg to
Now
go to Reading, Massachusetts.
Put into perspective the ages of these men for Bob.
I understand some of them were as young as maybe 15 or 16, and then you had some that were as old as maybe in the early 40s.
So it's quite a range of fathers, sons, brothers, husbands,
yes.
lovers that went off to war.
Yes.
We know that the 54th, which is famous because of Denzel Washington's film Glory, we know that they did serious battle shortly after Gettysburg. Would you talk about that?
Yes. In fact, it was around July the 18th. Now, actually, the 54th, once they were formed, they went by steamer down to North Carolina, and they engaged the battle with Fort Wagner in July the 18th of 1863.
So this Fort Wagner battle, which is glorified in the film Glory, is only 10 days after the retreat from Gettysburg.
Yes, very close.
Very close. You talk a lot about black soldiers. What was the condition that these men found once they were in the field?
Well, they found several things. First of all, they did not receive the pay that white soldiers received, and at first the pay was delayed. They weren't even paid on time, and some of the training that they had was not the best of training. Their rations were not as well. The equipment that they had was not the first class.
Now, you had asked me about Thaddeus Stevens, and I know we're going to get to talk a lot this evening about Thaddeus Stevens, but I understand that Thaddeus Stevens and Octavio Cato petitioned for equal pay?
Equal pay and equal rations for the USCT. Yes, they did.
And before we bring our next guest in, could you tell me where else? I know that black troops also trained in Philadelphia at Camp William Penn?
Yes, the 1st of July, Camp William Penn opened, which was in the northern part of Philadelphia. And there again, troops from central Pennsylvania, young men from central Pennsylvania were recruited and sent down to form the 3rd USCT, which was the 1st regiment at Camp William Penn.
Here's a good place to pause and bring our second guest, George Nagel, in The Years of the Jubilee. Is his 2-part book, and we'll talk about this Day of Jubilee in Camp William Penn when George joins us.
Hello, I'm Nancy Mendis. I'm a visual artist, designer, and I'm an exhibit designer for the Bethel Trail Project. We're standing at the end of the Bethel Trail, at the Pennsylvania National Fire Museum at 1820 North 4th Street. Our host is Dave Houseal. Now, this museum has been a volunteer effort for the last 18 years, is that right?
Yes, it has been. The firehouse that you're in is an 1899 firehouse, and it was active until 1980. And at that time, it fell into some really hard times, went to a private individual, and then the city took it back, and they restored it completely, and we now house one of the finest collections in central Pennsylvania anyway of the fire service history. And we're all volunteer staffed.
Excellent.
And we're also open full time every day but Monday.
Excellent. Well, can you tell me something about these fire engines?
Well, I can tell you, one of the exhibits that we opened 2 months ago was because of the 150th anniversary of Gettysburg and Pennsylvania's role during the war. We highlighted a subject which has not been touched upon by anyone that I know of in researching the Civil War, and that's the firefighters during the Civil War. Not necessarily, their military aspect, although that's covered too, but we highlight the equipment. We have detailed information on the type of equipment that they used, everything to the parades and celebrations and the different military companies and disasters within the state. So,
We usually think of firemen as being very brave and strong and heroic. And you mentioned parades and celebrations. Can you tell me a little more about that?
well, let's go upstairs and we can take a look.
Yeah. Firemen on parade, parades and celebrations. The firemen really loved their parades and celebrations, didn't they?
Oh, yes.
And why did they do it?
Well, they did it for any number of reasons. If a volunteer company got a new piece of apparatus, they would celebrate. And if there was multiple companies in the towns, like Harrisburg had 7, or even Philadelphia had 50, 60, 70 companies, any number of reasons would get 2, 3, 4 companies together and they would parade.
These panels are about celebrations that took place in the 20th century. But when did the tradition begin?
Probably back in the colonial period, or even maybe before that. Once they were organized into companies, it followed a military bearing somewhat, and then they continued on with it was somewhat rivalry, somewhat competition. One could outdo the other with different uniforms or different colors and things like that.
Well, speaking of military bearing, did they continue these parades during the Civil War?
Not necessarily. I've very few instances that I have seen or read where they actually had parades. Once you got past the first couple months of the war, the hard reality of war started to set in. Not only that, the volunteer companies, the manpower was greatly diminished because some of the first enlistees enthusiastically were the volunteer firemen. So a lot of these companies were greatly diminished in manpower.
I see.
One of the one that I did run into was in Philadelphia, October of 1864, when the 72nd Pennsylvania, which was the Philadelphia Fire Zouave unit, started out with about 1,500 men, and they were mustered out in Philadelphia, and there was about 200 men there. But a lot of the volunteer fire companies got together and they paraded with them through the town.
The Zouave unit, is this where the red shirts came from?
Well, that was one of the red shirts. These red shirts, the firemen's traditional red shirts, started in the New York Fire Department about the 1840s.
These are some of the parade hats that the firemen wore during some of their parades and celebrations, is that correct?
That's correct.
And this year we're celebrating the work of 19th century artist David Bustle Bowser, who painted the well-known portrait of John Brown, the abolitionist, and Abraham Lincoln. And he also painted these. We don't know which ones of these he painted, but he did paint some of them. I am really amazed by the detail and the intricacy, the craft, the fine art that we see on these. And they are commercial art pieces. And he would do this for more than one person, right? They're not just one of a kind.
Oh no, these are not one of a kind. The companies, in particular with these ones from Philadelphia, the volunteer fire companies at that time had sizable amounts of manpower because they needed that to pull the apparatus and also to pump the big hand engines to pump water at fires. Most of these companies had anywhere from 100 to 200 to 250 men in them.
I like this part of the exhibit because it shows us the real people involved in firefighting. Were there any African American volunteers in the fire department?
I'm Harrisburg's fire department historian, and I've done a lot of in-depth research, and I have not unearthed anyone, any black members of the department. However, Caleb Jackson has given me some information that leads me to believe that at that time period, there well could have been.
Well, keep up the good work. We really want to know the answer to that question, and I appreciate your letting us come here today. Thank you for joining us at the Pennsylvania National Fire Museum at 1820 North 4th Street in Harrisburg.
Well, good evening. We're back with our program, and we're welcoming George Nagel, historian George Nagel. And George, following up on the earlier discussion now, we're at June of 1863. Confederate forces under Robert E. Lee have crossed the border, state border, and they've invaded Pennsylvania. They're closing. Tens of thousands of Confederate troops are coming, heading north, closing in on the capital city of Harrisburg. But our young, brave young men have been recruited and are on their way to training. As the Confederate forces approach, anxiety is building in the city of Harrisburg. And what were things like on the home front at that particular time in history?
Well, Bob, actually, Harrisburg was in absolute chaos at this point. From as early as June 15th, the city had frequent rumors of invasion, and each one generated its own frenetic activity. As people got out of town, they packed up their possessions, they shipped them out on the railroad. For Harrisburg's African American community, it was even more so because, as was mentioned earlier, so many of the young men had left town weeks earlier to volunteer in Massachusetts. The idea that so many young men had left town, had left their families vulnerable, was causing a lot of anxiety in Harrisburg's black community. And now with the invasion really suddenly on us, as I mentioned, as early as June 15th, there was an early rumor, and things died down. But then by June 22nd or so, it became evident that the Confederate troops really were headed to Harrisburg. And people just became crazy with anxiety and shipping things out. The state of Pennsylvania was shipping everything out from the state capitol. They were packing up paintings, the treasury, state papers, putting them on the trains and sending them east to Philadelphia or up to New York even. So to see that your entire government was bugging out of town was causing huge anxiety to the community. There was a really good eyewitness account of what it was like for blacks in Harrisburg at the time. An internationally known pianist, Louis Gottschalk, had been booked into Harrisburg, and he was very peeved at his booking agent for putting him in the path of the invasion. But he decided to make the best of it. He was a diarist, so he wrote down everything that he observed. He took dinner on the evening of late in June at the Jones House, which is right on the square in Harrisburg. The Jones House employed a lot of African American waiters and cooks and servants. So he was in the dining room with all of the local reporters from papers. The New York papers had sent reporters, Philadelphia had sent reporters. So he was there with all these rowdy, robust men, and they're talking about the invasion, and they're saying, well, I guess Robert E. Lee will be in town by tomorrow. And he watched the waiters, and he said every time one of them would come up with a comment like that, they would physically blanch. He said you could just see their faces as color drained from them. He could see that visible fear. He could see that anxiety. Now, speaking about visible fear, George, you talk so eloquently in your book, Years of Jubilee, about the road from Greencastle. And would you talk about kidnapping of free people of color along that route? And one of the aspects of the invasion that was so anxiety producing, so fear producing among central Pennsylvania's black population was first the rumor that Confederate troops were going to take pretty much every black person that they found back south. And the idea was that there were a lot of fugitive slaves living in Pennsylvania and that they had come to take these slaves, recover them, and take them back. And of course, these rumors turned out to be true, but they were capturing not only fugitive slaves, they were capturing pretty much any person of color that they found.
Now, there was a count of bounty, $10 a head if you got somebody to Baltimore. Or would you talk a little bit about the relationship between Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and the route on 11, and the Baltimore slave pens?
Yes. There were a number of kidnapping rings, if you will, that operated in central and especially south central PA. They were really prolific in the border counties, Adams County, York County, also Philadelphia, and they would lure persons, generally young black men, and kidnap them, essentially take them to Baltimore and sell them to slave dealers that had headquarters in Baltimore. Baltimore then had a direct link to Louisiana, and they were then shipped pretty much directly south to the Deep South. And these the kidnapping rings operated very much out in the open in the 1830s, 40s, but they were still in existence up into the 1850s and even 1860s.
So, Bob, you had all these people along Route 11 and 15 fleeing to Harrisburg, not knowing that that's really where Robert E. Lee was trying to get to in the first place, George?
Robert E. Lee, well, the entire Army of Northern Virginia, as it was crossing the border into Pennsylvania, had as its goal ultimately to surround Washington, D.C., but they wanted to do it by way of Harrisburg. Come north into Pennsylvania, capture the capital of Pennsylvania. So yes, Harrisburg was very much the object of the invasion into Pennsylvania.
Why Harrisburg?
Harrisburg had a number of things. For one thing, being the capital of the state, there was that political component. If you could actually put the government out of business on one of the major and really, well, the Keystone State. Pennsylvania is called the Keystone State for a number of reasons, but it would put this huge hole in the north. If you could put the government out of business. Also, Harrisburg had a huge industrial corridor. Most of the railroads had to run through Harrisburg to get to the west or to get to the north. The state system, the state works system still ran through Harrisburg, so even the canals, which were still moving freight but less important than the railroads, were here. A lot of industries. And Harrisburg also was really the key to Philadelphia as well and other northern cities. From Harrisburg could be used as a springboard to Philadelphia and ultimately to threaten New York City.
So now, as a free man of color along this road, Bob, so I get snatched and I'm taken to Baltimore and put in a holding pen or a prison pen. What recourse do I have, George?
Virtually none. Once you're away from friends, once you're away from contacts, you have virtually no recourse. You have no legal recourse in Maryland. Now, if you're a free person, a freeborn person, and you can prove it, and you can get to the authorities in Baltimore, you would probably be released.
If I could prove it. But I believe you told me once I couldn't speak in court. So who spoke for me? How did I prove that I was free?
Well, that was the catch-22, if you will. If you had someone, you couldn't speak in court, but if you had someone that knew you were there, for one thing, they could come and they could speak, a white person that is, could speak on your behalf.
And we know there's a very famous white person who spoke on my behalf, Mordecai McKinney, who was a lawyer. Would you tell us a bit about?
Mordecai McKinney, yes, he was a lawyer in Harrisburg, and he operated a very successful law business, was a judge as well, in fact. But he began to represent fugitive slaves that were captured in Harrisburg. He and Charles Ron, who worked with him. He would go into court in Harrisburg and speak on behalf of fugitive slaves that were captured.
So we had kidnapping in the city of Harrisburg at this time as well.
Kidnapping, as well as in 1850, the fugitive slave law allowed slaveholders to send agents on their behalf to round up fugitive slaves that they knew to be theirs. So it wasn't necessarily just kidnapping. It was actually under the 1850 guise of the fugitive slave law. It was part of federal law.
This is a great time for us to bring the young, dynamic Todd Neely into the conversation with his 2-volume book on William Day, where we can explore the rights of black men in the military and the condition of their families and their communities at home.
We're at the third stop of Bethel Trail, and we're at the Pennsylvania State Archives with Linda Reese, the director of the Arrangement and Description section. We're looking at the Civil War muster rolls. Linda, can you tell us what the muster rolls are?
Well, the U.S. Army kept records, lists of the soldiers as they were mustered into service or entered into service, and they kept lists of soldiers when they exited service or mustered out. And what we have here are the mustering out rolls, which are very, very useful for researchers and scholars because it gives the status of a particular company or regiment at their point of discharge. And there's a lot of good information on here on what happened to each soldier during their time of enlistment, whether they made it through the war, whether they died, whether they were wounded, and basically what battles they were in. So it's a good place for research for anyone looking for their Civil War ancestor. These are like the equivalent of the modern DD-214, which is the current U.S. Army's discharge form.
Well, can you give us an example of some of the information that's on here,
yes,
and how those notations developed?
Yes, if you read from left to right, there's a soldier's name, and it gives information about when they entered service, who their captain was, often where they entered service, and then the most interesting to us is the remarks column, which tells what happened to the soldier. For example, the one person we have here is Robert Fortin, who was the son of James Fortin, a very famous Philadelphia African-American. And under the remarks column, it mentions that he died in April of 1864 of disease at the U.S. Army Hospital in Philadelphia. The story goes he was drilling soldiers in the rain. So these are the official government records of these soldiers. So this is the authoritative information on what happened to this soldier and the 330,000 soldiers who served in Pennsylvania during the Civil War.
Can you tell us about the United States Colored Troops muster rolls?
Yes, Pennsylvania mustered more U.S. colored troops than any other northern state, even Massachusetts, which is the state we associate with the USCT. We have 97 mustering out rolls relating to the USCT, and there are about 8,000 names on these rolls. And only about half of the people on these 97 rolls are list Pennsylvania as their residents. A lot of them came from out of state. They came from a lot of southern states, like Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. When the African Americans heard that Pennsylvania was recruiting soldiers, they left where they were in the South and they came north and they registered in Pennsylvania to fight.
How can our viewers use the muster rolls to research their ancestry?
Well, first they can start by going online and they can look at an alphabetical index to all the soldiers who fought from Pennsylvania. And that the card that will come up will give you a regiment and a company number, and then you can come here and ask for that particular regiment and company number and see your ancestor's name on these rolls. Another thing we're doing is we are scanning all of the rolls. There's over 2,500 of them, and this is being done for us in partnership with Ancestry.com. And so we hope to put them online sometime toward the end of 2013, so people can access them through the Ancestry.com website, and after a couple of years, Ancestry.com will make them publicly available.
That's exciting.
And we do have Ancestry.com for free here in the archive search room.
Really?
We do.
That is exciting and
We do.
interesting. These muster rolls were made in the 1860s. How are they preserved?
Well, they were kept by the State Adjutant General's office after the war, and they were used quite a bit for purposes of for soldiers to obtain pensions, or if they needed a flag for the grave or something like that. And it was a way of for a soldier to prove service. And the Adjutant General's office used them and abused them. They were folded and unfolded. They were put in filing cabinets, jammed into filing cabinets, grabbed out of filing cabinets, and over the course of 150 years, they have broken along their fold lines. They were torn, they were dirty, and this is a great example of how they looked when we came across them. A lot of well-intentioned efforts to tape them along their fold lines. And now the tape has done a lot of damage. You can see there the yellow mark from the glue on the tape, and the tape is covering up the names and a lot of the wording. So what we had to do was, for just about every single one of them, we have to remove the tape, we clean them, we kind of bleach out the yellowness, and we repair them with an opaque Japanese mending tissue. And then we encapsulate them like the ones here. And this is the after product of conservation. They are lying within these 2 sheets of clear polyester film. So you can handle them without getting dirt on them. And it took 7 years and $1 million to do this project for 2,500 of these mustering out rolls. It was about $500 per roll, per sheet of paper.
And it's certainly worth the effort.
Oh, definitely. And we already have people coming in to do research who are very, very pleased with the information they're finding about their ancestor. A lot of the details are not in the standard history, like Bates's history, the Pennsylvania Volunteer. There's much, much, much more detailed information on here than you would find in Bates.
So what is the best way to make them live?
The best way to make them live is to come down here to the state archives and use them, research them, find out their stories. Every soldier has a story. They are public records, these documents. We, the people of Pennsylvania, own these records, and we are free. It's free to come in to ask for and research these records. Like we said, every soldier has a story, and it's wonderful Pennsylvania history.
Welcome back to our discussion tonight about the Civil War era and its impact on the African American community in the city of Harrisburg. We've been joined by historian Todd Mealy. Todd, we were just talking about kidnapping and snatching freed people of color and transporting them out of the area and back into a condition of slavery. Were there any cases in Harrisburg that were notable at that time?
Yeah, now this is a decade before the Civil War, but George mentioned the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850. Well, just a year and a half or so after that, 1851 into 1852, a free African American living in Harrisburg by the name of Jim Phillips was kidnapped out of Harrisburg and taken down into Virginia, into Richmond, and placed on the auction block. Immediately after his kidnapping, the Anti-Slavery Society in Harrisburg, led by some folks you guys have mentioned already, but one, Charles Rawn, a lawyer, quickly gathered enough money with help from the African American church and went down into Virginia and actually bought Jim Phillips's freedom and brought him back into Harrisburg.
Incredible.
Yeah.
So this was a really an era of churning and change and a combination of exuberance at the approach of the following the proclamation and a positive attitude towards getting involved in the conflict.
Yeah.
And at the same time, the threat and the anxiety caused by the invasion. What impact did that have on the population in Harrisburg and the African American leadership in the community?
Yeah, in regards to leadership, now not everyone from Harrisburg went to fight in the war. There was a significant number of men and women who were still in Harrisburg, really excited in developing a civil rights movement. By 1864, nationwide, the first Equal Rights League, called the National Equal Rights League, was formed at a huge convention up in Syracuse, New York. Now, the purpose of the National Equal Rights League was to try to start at the national level, state level, and then local level civil rights campaigns that would work for things like pensions for veterans, voting rights, equal wages, schooling, a number of things, right to sit on juries. And that trickled down into Harrisburg in the middle of the Civil War. And there were a lot of people in Harrisburg who were at that convention, came back to the city and formed Harrisburg's local Equal Rights League. It was called the Garnett League. And the Garnett League was named after Henry Highland Garnett. Now, from New York, but Garnett, 20 years before the Civil War, was advocating at a time when no one advocated for those who were enslaved to revolt against their slave owners. And people in Harrisburg were, that message had resonated with them. And at the start of the war, in 1861, blacks in Harrisburg formed the Garnett Militia, or Garnett Guard, which was a home guard, where African Americans in the city, though it was against federal law to arm blacks in America, formed a local militia without arms, and even trained, and were ready to go and serve. And that leadership was left behind by 1864 into 1865 at the tail end of the Civil War, leading this burgeoning civil rights movement.
Now, I understand that Pennsylvania was the first to arm black men.
Uh-huh.
And how did that come to be, and what was the reaction of the general population to arming black men?
Well, the reaction to the local population, there weren't a lot of people in favor. Now, there's an interesting way to look at this. There were a lot of people in Pennsylvania who were anti-slavery, but just because one was opposed to slavery doesn't mean they were for full equality. And so there was resistance, significant resistance to arming African Americans, whether it be in the beginning of the Civil War or at the tail end of the Civil War.
Todd, help us out here, because we use these terms anti-slavery and abolitionist as though they were interchangeable terms, when in fact they are not. Could you clarify the two terms for us?
Well, you would have folks that were anti-slavery, which means morally they believed that there was something gravely wrong with the institution of slavery. Then you would have, say, abolitionists. Anti-slavery advocates, I would say, would be predominantly white. Okay. Then you would have abolitionists, which would not get involved in Underground Railroad activity, but perhaps buy the newspapers or donate or attend anti-slavery lectures, in some way or another, without physically helping a freedom seeker escape, but in other means would support the cause of freedom. And then you would have your Underground Railroad operatives, which were those who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad is something that goes off to what I was saying earlier about this Equal Rights League movement, because that was an organized movement, the civil rights movement that began in 1864. It was something that was nationwide. It just wasn't local, and everyone really coordinated with each other. But that began with, the Underground Railroad, because starting in the 1830s, blacks in America met yearly and discussed issues related to freedom seekers and protecting the legal rights of free blacks in the country. Those nationwide leaders would come back and discuss those same things locally, and then so now all of a sudden you had Harrisburg's Underground Railroad operation working with those in Ohio or those in New York or those in Massachusetts. And then once the Civil War came and then the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and blacks are now serving in the Union Army, and now they're talking about civil rights, because that's what this war is fought for. It's fought for freedom.
And I understand there was quite a few large Negro conventions and conferences and convenings here, with special events on the city island. And how did that happen?
Well,
how did that work?
Yeah, the
Who
civil
put it together?
This Equal Rights League in Harrisburg was formed a year after the nationwide group was formed. So in the fall of 1865, the Garnett Equal Rights League was formed here in Harrisburg. And their kickoff events were in October and November of '65. In October of 1865, for the first time, William Howard Day had visited the city and gave a speech recruiting folks in Harrisburg to join the civil rights movement. And then they started to organize for what most of us in Harrisburg are familiar with, the United States Colored Troops Grand Review, which was held in November of 1865, and that was the Garnett Equal Rights League's second event.
And Mr. Day was the keynote speaker of that?
Yeah, and
Who else was involved?
Thomas Morris Chester was involved. Stephen Smith from Columbia was involved, and Octavius Cato from Philadelphia were all involved. They were the four major speakers of the USCT Grand Review Parade, and then that evening they also gave speeches at separate venues.
And the women, what part did they play?
Well, women played a significant role in organizing the event and in finding places for folks who were coming in from outside of Harrisburg to board or stay for the evening.
This is not an easy task. Will you dwell on this for a moment? With segregated hotels and over 500 delegates from across the state, where did they put people?
Those who came in from outside of Harrisburg boarded with blacks who lived in Harrisburg. For instance, William Howard Day was not a resident of Harrisburg yet. He's still 8 years away before he permanently moves to Harrisburg. He stayed at the house of Cassius Brown, and Cassius Brown was a barber at the United States Hotel, which was located here. But he boarded with Brown every time he came to Harrisburg.
Here's a great opportunity for us to bring the three gentlemen together into a conversation and weave together the three statements about life in Harrisburg for African Americans during the Civil War. Now, we were talking about this notion of civil rights, and most of us listening, black or white, think that civil rights is a late 19th century, early 20th century kind of concept. And Todd was telling us, Bob, about civil rights movements as early as the 1830s.
Yeah, Todd raised an interesting point about a law that amended or expanded the Pennsylvania Constitution to actually, in 1838, actually eliminate free men of color from voting. How could that happen?
Well, you know, many historians call the modern 1950s, 60s civil rights movement the Second Reconstruction. And that's because a lot of the ideas and tactics from these early civil rights workers were reemployed by those in the 50s and 60s. But yeah, when Pennsylvania's Constitution was originally written in the Revolutionary era, it stated that all freeborn men in the state of Pennsylvania could vote, regardless of race. So there was a time in early Pennsylvania's history where blacks were voting. But that changed, and that's rooted in gradual abolition in the state. When Pennsylvania's Assembly passed a gradual abolition law in 1780, over the course of 28 years, roughly 30 years, those who were enslaved were being emancipated. And by 1810, 1820, 1830, Harrisburg has developed a really large and significant and influential free black population. And that threatened a lot of white people. So by the middle of the 1830s, there was such a strong influence now in the state assembly that a state constitutional convention was called to rewrite the Constitution. And in this 1838 Constitution, it specifically said the word white. Whites could vote. Only whites could sit on juries, and those rights and others were taken away from free black Pennsylvanians.
So free black Pennsylvanians voted in 1838. We don't know this. How long did it take for those same Pennsylvanians and in general and free men of color in Harrisburg in particular to gain
Well,
that right?
from the end of the Civil War to the modern civil rights movement, the civil rights movement was this effort to align state law with federal law. And Pennsylvania's state law after 1838 said that black men in the state of Pennsylvania couldn't vote. But when the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870, the federal law said black men can vote. So it depended upon where you lived then in Pennsylvania. If it was a sympathetic community, black men would vote in that part of Pennsylvania between 1870 and the time that Pennsylvania's Constitution was rewritten again in 1875. There was a 5-year period where in some parts of the state, black men could vote. Other parts of the state, which weren't as friendly, black men couldn't vote. And as we're well aware, one significant Pennsylvanian lost his life trying to encourage and mobilize black voters in Philadelphia, and that's Octavius Cato.
Who was killed on his way to the voting box, correct?
And taking others to go and vote, and that was in October of 1871.
Now, Caleb, you talked about Thomas Chester reporting about voting in the field.
In the 1864 presidential election. He was basically covering the USCT in Northern Virginia, and he mentioned that the men from Pennsylvania could not vote and send their vote back to their state. But some blacks from other states that would accept the vote were able to vote in the field and send back their vote.
Now, we know, George, that these things were reported in our newspaper. We didn't have exactly a harmonic press at that time. I know the press in Harrisburg was very divided about this. Could you talk about the role of the press between 1861 and 1865?
Well, newspapers at the time were very often little more than democratic organs, and often they were begun in that way. Someone would get some money together during a campaign, begin a newspaper, and if the newspaper was successful, it would continue and become what would be a regular news reporting item, but they still maintained those political loyalties. Harrisburg had a Democratic paper, which was the Patriot and Union, and then it also had a Republican newspaper, which was the Telegraph, and each had its own take on events. Everything that was reported was either to the Democratic point of view or the Republican point of view.
And one of those newspapers was very provocative around the issue of arming black men. Would you tell us about that?
The Patriot and Union in particular would drum up all sorts of fears in that. It would, in fact, at one point it even published an advertisement that General Lane, this was in 1862, a General Lane was in Harrisburg and was recruiting soldiers for his colored regiment, as they termed it. Now, this was General James Lane, who was a Kansas guerrilla fighter and very known as Bloody Jim Lane.
Part of the John Brown gang there?
Yes, it was that whole legacy of violence. And of course, this stirred up all sorts of commotion in Harrisburg, both on the white side, which was the fear, and that's exactly what the Patriot wanted to do, was create this fear of arming blacks.
So Bob and I were talking about, we're getting close to the end. We could talk to you gentlemen for about 100 more days about this great history. But here we are at the 150th commemoration of the Civil War. So I ask each of you gentlemen, why should we care about this? What does it mean to the African American community? And how do you think African Americans should participate and commemorate in this year? Caleb, why should anybody care?
Well, African Americans, especially since the book on roots, have gone, they have more family reunions, they're starting to look at their individual history. And they realize that during the Civil War or before, most of their relatives, their ancestors, were either slaves in the South or free people in the North. And they know that a lot of their ancestors participated for the USCT. And they like to get the actual events to read about their forefathers and what they did. So it's
George,
very, very important.
What should we commemorate? I mean, if I'm a Southerner, it's the War of Northern Aggression. You know, if I'm a Northerner, it's the War of the Rebellion.
Right.
So depending upon where I'm standing, both in history and in geography, I have a different opinion. So what should Bob's community and our constituency commemorate and celebrate.
Well, it's interesting that both sides during the war took as their heroes the revolutionary commanders. George Washington was a hero to both sides. He might have been a Virginian, but he was a hero to the Confederacy as much as to the Union. So it was that event, it was that coming back together, and that what we can commemorate from the Civil War is the fact that we didn't pull apart into two separate nations, that we became a federally centered nation and not a gathering of, well, what is now 50 separate states.
You know, and as we speak, we have an African American president and we have an African American female mayor in the city of Harrisburg. So this arc of history is fascinating and ongoing. Todd, any insight into that?
Well, the legacy of the Civil War is freedom. This is the issue of race, and race is not some ancillary item in American history. I think it's at the core, which is why I have always been so passionate about topics related to social justice and the Civil War and civil rights. If folks could really try to study these issues surrounding race in the Civil War, then I think what Americans will do is they'll develop more empathy. Empathy for people of a different color, different race, bilingual Americans, LGBT community. I think those are things that could be learned from those that would, study the Civil War a little bit more or pay attention to the Civil War.
Speaking about that study and that immersion, could you tell us about your books, your two-part?
Okay, so a couple years ago, I finished a 2-volume book on William Howard Day. I'm very passionate about the things I've learned from his life. William Day was born in New York City, born free. His father died when he was young, and he was given up for adoption. He was adopted by a white family from Massachusetts.
And George, your two-part book, the Years of Jubilee?
Oh, the Year of Jubilee is really a history of Harrisburg's black community from its inception up through 1863, and how they withstood this, the year of 1863 being that year of Jubilee with the invasion.
And Caleb, you found a new book about William Morris Chester. Did you like to share?
Yes. Thomas Morris Chester, as a lot of us know, was born in Harrisburg. He was the only black major Civil War correspondent. And Professor Blackett at Vanderbilt has written a great book on him, and he's transcribed the writings of Thomas Morris Chester from the Philadelphia Press and presented those in the book.
So we've got some reading to do and some talking at the dinner table and some chatting, Bob,
Absolutely.
as we take this conversation about the 150th sesquicentennial, too hard to say, so we call it Civil War 150, into our open dialogue in our community exchange. We'd like to thank you for joining us in this first episode, first part of the series, Unfinished Work, a term that comes from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This is also the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. We'll explore the impact of the war in on Harrisburg's women, children, and orphans in our next series. Until then, keep reading. Thank you.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching